Alright, this is U.S. History Unit 5, Video 1, and in this video we're going to take a look at the economic disparity as well as Lincoln's use of his presidential powers during the Civil War. So economic disparity here, the word parity means equality, so disparity would just mean inequality here. And looking at the war from strictly a numbers perspective, the North should have won this war pretty quickly. They had an advantage in population, in industrial output, in miles of railroad tracks. So really, from this standpoint, it shouldn't have been close. But there were some other things the South was able to do to keep this war going on for 4 years. With the North developing into an industrial power, they had larger populations in their cities, which more densely populated as well, and they had a larger workforce to fill these jobs, and so they had the larger population, obviously. And because of this manufacturing, the North needed more transportation networks, and so they had lots of railroad tracks to ship all of these goods, and so that is the reason for so many miles of railroad tracks. I'm not sure how well you can see this chart, but the blue is the north and the gray here is the south, and you can see population. The north had 70% or 71%, and of this 29% in population that the south had, a large percentage of that, about a third actually, was enslaved. So really you're talking about 20% here in terms of people who are able to go to war for the south. Railroad mileage, really, I mean, it's across the board. The only thing the South has an advantage is in large farms, but the North has plenty of farms in the Midwest, just not quite the size of the South. So really, that advantage is not even as great as it looks. Lincoln and habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is a Latin term which you maybe probably even have never heard of. It's in the Constitution, and it's a constitutional right of every American citizen. And Lincoln's number one goal throughout the entire war was to preserve the Union. It wasn't to end slavery. And not all Northerners were on board with this mission, and in fact, some were Southern sympathizers. In some states, specifically Maryland, which was a slaveholding state, but it did not join the Confederacy, it stayed in the Union, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, which is your constitutional right that says anyone who is imprisoned must be taken before a judge to determine if they're being held legally or not. It's not your actual trial, it's just going before the judge, almost like a hearing, to say, okay, here's the evidence that we have, and if you can prove enough evidence to keep the prisoner, then they're held. But if you don't have enough evidence to do that, then the judge will tell you to let them go. In times of national emergency, however, the president can suspend this right, and the Constitution allowed Lincoln to do that. And as a result, over 13,000 Confederate sympathizers were thrown in jail in throughout the entire North. In states that did not secede, states that joined the Union, they were thrown in jail without a trial. And this was all a part of Lincoln's plan to preserve the Union, because these Southern sympathizers couldn't help the Confederacy if they were in jail. After the war was over, they were released, but it was, as you can see, thousands of people that got thrown in jail because of this. And here's just a image for this. Aims to prevent the unjust detention of prisoners. So, how did differences in population, functioning railroads, and industrial output help the North during the Civil War? Well, obviously, population means they're going to have a larger fighting force. Functioning railroads means they can ship goods and supplies quickly throughout the country. And industrial output are these, a lot of this is weaponry that the North is making, and any other kind of, armor or anything like that, that cannons and that sort of thing that the North needs, they have an advantage in getting that quicker. So really all three of those things help to serve the North in the advantage. The second question asks, why did Lincoln suspend habeas corpus during the Civil War? So, as we said, habeas corpus, a Latin term, it means to hold the body in Latin. So that makes sense if you think about what Lincoln does here. So he throws these Southern sympathizers, these people who he's afraid will be, kind of lenient or loyal to the Confederacy, even though they don't live in a Confederate state. So he throws them in jail for the war, throughout the entire war. So that he can kind of silence them and not have them help the Confederacy. And that's his really number one goal, is to take away any kind of aid from the Confederacy. All right, let's talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. This probably is a term that you've at least heard of. There's some misunderstandings about what it did, though. After the Battle of Antietam in 1862, and we'll talk about that later in the next video, but Lincoln issues this Emancipation Proclamation, and it emancipated, which means freed, all slaves in southern states that left the Union. And that last part is very important. It's only slaves in Confederate states that had seceded that this actually freed. Lincoln's hope was that this news would reach the southern plantations and the slaves would flee, to the north, that they would flee. And he believed the only reason the Confederacy was still able to fight was because slaves were doing most of the work back home on the farms. And so the proclamation really was a war measure because Lincoln thought that the soldiers would have to go back home and tend to their fields if the slaves had left. So just growing food and that sort of thing, if the slaves are gone from the South, then in Lincoln's mind, they'll go away. These troops will have to go back home and they won't be able to fight. So the emancipation was really a war measure in that way. Here's a little bit of the proclamation here if you want to pause and read this, but it just gives you kind of a overview. We'll also talk about the Gettysburg Address. You've also probably heard of this. If not, you've heard of the first line probably. So this is 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, which again, we will talk about this specific battle in the next video. But Lincoln spoke at the Gettysburg National Cemetery dedication. So they were dedicating this cemetery here. And many expected Lincoln to give this very long, eloquent speech, as was typical of speeches of his day. The guy that spoke before him spoke for about 2 hours, but Lincoln spoke for just 2 minutes, and his speech began with that famous line, 407 years ago. A score is 20 years, so that's 4 score, which is 80, and 7 years, so 87 years ago. And he's referring to the Declaration of Independence, 1776. The speech talked about continuing the fight to save the Union, which the Founding Fathers had fought for, and that's what he's saying, preserve the Union. And today it's one of the most well-known speeches in American history, and it raised the spirit of Northerners who were growing weary of the war. This was a very, very bloody battle, the bloodiest battle of the entire war, and so even in the North, people were growing tired of all of the bloodshed. So this speech helped to raise morale in the North. And again, it was only 2 minutes long, so here's the entire speech right here that you could pause and read and get a good idea of as well. Lincoln's second inaugural address. So this is when he's elected a second time in 1864. And at the time of his inauguration in 1865, a Northern victory was pretty much all but locked up. But rather than boast over the defeated Confederate states, Lincoln expressed sorrow that the war couldn't have been avoided. He talked about how he wished that this didn't have to happen, despite the North about to finish the job. He urged his supporters, people in the North, not to seek revenge over the former slaveholders, and he started talking about reconstruction of the South with malice toward none, which is kind of ill will, the word malice, hatred, with charity for all. So he's wanting still to bring the country together, and it shows Lincoln's number one goal of his presidency, which was to preserve the Union. He's still chasing that goal. And there's a quote from Lincoln's address there. So 2 questions here. As stated in Lincoln's second inaugural address, as well as the Gettysburg Address, why did Lincoln believe it was important to fight the Civil War? He believed it was necessary, that it was important to fight this war so that they could preserve this country, so that they could save the Union, so that the Founding Fathers' work didn't, die in vain, that it was kept alive here by the Civil War. So that was what he talked about in both of those. And then also, why was the Emancipation Proclamation issued? We talked about it being a war measure, the belief that if these slaves would flee, that they could, get away, and then these Southern troops would have to return home and tend to their fields. So it was meant to be just that, a war measure.